רחמים שוכן במרומים המסם מלוכה נכונה על כנפי השכינה.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I would just like to refer to the time when I was a member of the synagogue and how very nostalgic I feel to be here and see a lot of old friends and see how well it's grown and developed. And this was the place where my children grew up. They went to Haida. My son was, Jeffrey was bar mitzvahed here. They didn't have bar mitzvahs for girls at that time, but Shannon was never short of things to do here because it was a very active and wonderful community. And my brother, Sir Ben Helfgott, got married here. And there were lots of committees, and my husband was very engaged with many of them. But of course he was preoccupied with the new hall that was going to be built. And we formed lifelong friends here in this community. So coming back after all these years, it's lovely to be here and to see you all. Now I know that I've got to speak about my 5.5 years under Nazi rule, and really it would take many hours to tell you the story, but I'll just refer to a few bits. And so you may know I was born in Poland, in Piotrków. And before the war, I was one of 3 children and had an older brother Ben, I have an older brother Ben, and a younger sister Lucia. And before the war, life for me in Poland was quite ordinary, the same as here, very happy life. I had friends and relatives in Piotrków, lots of cousins. And I won't concentrate on pre-war life in Poland because on the 1st of September 1939, my world turned upside down. All this lovely life stopped and we were invaded by Germany. They reached our home, Piotrków, within 5 days, and they took the whole of Poland within 2 weeks. We were quite near the German border, actually. And our town was the first one in, not just in Poland, but in Europe, to have a ghetto. So within 2 months of the beginning of the war, we were already incarcerated behind ghetto walls. They weren't actually solid walls, but those came later. But we were very heavily guarded. Our lives changed completely. We were deprived of the most basic human rights. There was great overcrowding. We had a community, a Jewish community of 15,000, but actually within a very short time there were 20,000 because lots of people from other parts that they extended their borders, they became occupied, Jews had to flee, lots of them found their way into our town, and we had 20,000. Overcrowding was terrible. Lots of people died through epidemics and inadequate, not only sanitary condition, but inadequate food, of course. And I won't concentrate on the ghetto because there's a lot to be said about it. But our lives really took on quite a different, different scene. And day by day it was getting worse. And after about 2.5 years, rumors started circulating that the ghetto is going to be dissolved and everybody is going to be deported. And we knew those deportations were going to Treblinka, Sobibor, Majdanek. These were all death camps. People arrived there and within a few hours they were gone. And of course we were all in panic, and people tried to think of ways to save themselves, but there weren't really many. Now the possibility was to get out of the ghetto, somehow smuggle oneself out of the ghetto and live in the forests or the sewers or anywhere out of sight, not to get deported. There were also different ways some people had friends who would perhaps taken 1 or 2 people, and my parents were, my father and my uncle, Joseph Klein, were introduced to a man from Częstochowa. Częstochowa was very on the border of Germany, and there were a lot of Germans living there. And this man was actually a German origin, living in Poland, and he was willing to hide 2 Jewish children, 2 Jewish girls. It was arranged that it will be me and my cousin, Ija Klein. And this man was doing it for money. And all the arrangements were made. We were smuggled out of the ghetto, and by train we went to Częstochowa, 1 at a time, a week apart. And the journey was actually very dangerous because there was reward for handing in Jews. And some people made it into quite a career, so walk around looking at people, they could be Jewish. And although we were both blue-eyed and we had fair hair, we were still very scared if someone looked at us for more than a minute. Well, not a minute, a few seconds, we saw they suspecting us of being Jewish, and they'll turn us over to the Gestapo. But we arrived 1 at a time at this house on the outskirts, and there was a middle-aged couple they were the parents-in-law of this man, and they took us in. I mean, they weren't treated us, they didn't treat us badly, but we were very homesick and we just couldn't bear it. We were very frightened. And if there was a knock on the door, we would have to hide, or sometimes it was okay to stay with the guests. But my cousin was so scared that she asked to be taken back to her parents. And she was told that she can't because the deportations are still going on, and she said that her parents have very good friends who are hiding their valuables, they'll take her in. And so he took her there, and I thought how lucky she was to be back with her parents or wherever she was, back in Piotrków. And eventually I went through quite a lot, which I don't have time to tell you, but after about, I don't know actually the time scale, but it was quite many weeks. Eventually the time was for me to go back. We met my father in a flour mill, which before the war was belonged to him, in partnership with his brother and another man. Now he was lucky to have a job there. And as I walked in, with this man, there was my father waiting for me, but also Ija's father, Joseph Klein. He looked at us and he went white. He said, "Where's my daughter?" And the man said, "I took her to your friends." And my uncle said, "But she's not there. Where is she?" what have you done with my child? And I still remember vividly my uncle with his hands behind his back, looking at the ground, pacing there and back, saying, what have you done with my child? And that is the end of the story. She's never been seen since. My uncle was soon after that also arrested, along with a lot of other people, men, my two uncles, three uncles and my father and other people. They were kept in prison for a little while. I don't know what that was about. I've never found out why they were arrested. Not that the Germans needed an excuse, but after a little while they were marched to the Jewish cemetery, lined up against the wall, and they were shot. But actually my father was released, and so there were two Helfgott brothers and two Klein brothers in there, and they kept two and released two. So one Helfgott and one Klein were executed at the cemetery. I returned to the ghetto with my father's working party, and we were very lucky in that our family was intact. My brother had their work permit. My father, mother and sister were with Christian people, each in a different family, and we survived that part. But people started returning afterwards, and whereas normally the entrance to the ghetto would always be, people would always be searched and counted, and it's only working parties that were going in and out. But at that time, they didn't look, they didn't count. People were just getting through, but they had their agenda. When they thought everybody was back, they started rounding them up. And on one occasion, they stormed into a room where I was with my mother and sister and lots of other people. And I was actually in bed only because I was okay, but I was so crowded and the bed was empty, and my husband went into it. As things were being shared, because of the overcrowding, there were some people who shared beds in the sense that when other people were out at work, their beds could be used by others who were around, not working. And on one occasion, they entered our room, the police entered our room, and took everybody away. But because I was in bed and I said I wasn't well, the policeman in charge said, that's all right, you can stay. And there I was. My mother said that she left me, she said, don't go anywhere, stay here. And of course my father and brother came home to learn the news that my mother's and sister were gone, and they were actually taken to the synagogue, which was in a very dilapidated state, and they were kept there without any food or water. They were being guarded by Ukrainian soldiers who used to shoot through the windows because they were bored. They were just to amuse themselves and often kill people. And they were there, I don't know how the time scale, but it was at least 2 or 3 weeks, under terrible conditions. And then they marched them out in groups of 50 at dawn to the local forest called Raków. And there they were murdered in the most shocking way, which we know exactly what happened, and there are lots of books about it. But I never actually spell it out when I speak about it. And these were the sort of killings in the forest that were taking place around that time. It was in about towards the end of 1942. And one of the biggest, now there were 520 people in the group with my mother, but the biggest one, where there were 3,000 people, was the one in Kiev, which apparently was sort of damaged by bombing recently. This was carried out by the Einsatzgruppen or the 101 battalions, but it was a terrible time. It was happening all over Europe, and these people were murdered. And the circumstances, they were shocking. After that, there were just the three of us left, my father, brother, and me. But they were still rounding people up, and on one occasion they rounded up an aunt of mine on the Helfgott side, and she was taken away screaming, "Who'll look after my child?" And by then I was the only female member of the Helfgott family left, and was down to me. I was 12 and she was 5, and I looked after her. After that, the ghetto was liquidated altogether, and there were just two places that we were sent to. One was plywood manufacturing. Well, it wasn't a factory, it was an enormous estate, and with lots of wood. And the other one was a glass works. I was allocated to that family, but before that, when they were trying to clear the small ghetto, it was called the small ghetto because there were only 2,200 people left after the deportations. And they allocated 1,000 to each, 1,100 to each factory. And but before all this happened, just before, as the workers were going to go to the places of work, they were building barracks there, it became a labor camp. But there were still some, what they called illegal people in the ghetto, and I was among them with my little cousin. And they only had some women and children and some elderly men left. All the others were workers. And they rounded us all up from the ghetto out, and we were standing outside in a long column, waiting to be loaded onto lorries which were arriving in the front, and people were going on there, and I was towards the end. And of course, just to describe a deportation, it would take quite a long time, but they were really very terrifying, especially for young children. And I had my little cousin with me. And I don't know what gave me the idea, but I looked to my right and saw a German officer standing there. He was in charge, obviously, but he wasn't doing anything, he was just looking. And I don't know how, but I went up to him, and of course I could have been shot, getting out of line. But I said to him that I've been separated from my father and brother, and can I go back inside the ghetto to them? And he was quite surprised and I think slightly amused. I don't know what he was thinking, but he called over a policeman and said, take it back inside the ghetto. And on the way, I said to him, just a minute, I've got to get my cousin. And he said, you can't. Only you have had permission. And I want you to think about that. People were faced with these situations all the time. And what was I to do? I was a young girl myself. I wanted to be with my father and brother, but do I leave my cousin? Do I stay with her? And these were the sort of dilemmas and the heartbreak among lots of other heartbreaks during the Holocaust. And somehow this policeman relented, and suddenly he said, "Oh, okay, quickly, take him, go inside." So we were safe again, and I was allocated to the plywood manufacturing place, and so was my father and brother. But in those places, men and women were always housed separately. So we were at one end of this enormous concern, and they were at the other end, but we did see one another from time to time, but we weren't together anymore. And we were there about 18 months, and I won't go into details about life there. And of course I became a slave laborer at the age of 12. But we were there about 18 months when they walked us to the railway station, and we were deported, men separately from women. I can tell we didn't know where we were going, but I can tell you that it was, the men were being deported to Buchenwald and the women to Ravensbrück concentration camp. Now, when we arrived in Ravensbrück, the first thing they did was take everything away from us. We had to queue up and give our names. As you know, they're meticulous at record keeping. And then we had to undress. They took our clothing away. They shaved our heads. We went through cold communal showers. And when we came out at the other end, we looked at one another, but we could not recognize each other. It is very difficult to actually describe what it does to you to be stripped of your identity, to just, we were just like zombies by then, because we couldn't recognize each other. And one of the things it does to you is make you lose hope. And without hope, there's no survival. And this showed itself very quickly because my aunt, Franja Klein, died very soon after that. My friend, Pema Blachman, died soon after that, after her. But people were just giving up. And you may have noticed that I mentioned people by name. It's because I knew them, of course. But I so feel very strongly that if anybody knows anybody's name who perished in the Shoah, do use them, because they have become numbers, really. We just talk about numbers. And because it's difficult to imagine 6 million people, I can't imagine them. So my aunt died, and so did my friend, and things were really bad and they were getting worse. But we weren't there all that long when they deported us to Bergen-Belsen. And now that was a shorter journey, because the first journey was 4.5 days in cattle trucks without any food or water. And people were dying, and people were fainting, and all sorts of things going on. Now, when we arrived in Bergen-Belsen, there wasn't any room for us. They put us up in a very large tent, enormous, bigger than the synagogue. And there were people from all over Europe, all different languages spoken, and there was chaos. But in the morning, they actually took us into the camp. And what we saw, and I'm sure you're all aware, you've all heard or seen pictures, but I'll just very briefly describe to you. that the first thing that hit you was the smog and the smell. And there were people there, but they were skeleton and just shuffling along aimlessly. And as they were shuffling, they collapsed and died. And there were dead bodies everywhere, and there were piles of corpses. It was a shocking scene. And as they were taking us to some barracks, and they were all overcrowded, I heard that there was a children's home somewhere in the camp. And I quickly set out to find it with my little cousin. We were interviewed by two women, a Dr. Bimka and Sister Luba. If you read about Bergen-Belsen, you'll come across their names. And after asking us a lot of questions, one of them turned to me and said, well, we are also very overcrowded, but in any case, you are too old, she said to me. And I was by then 14. And I said, okay, I understand, will you take my cousin? And they said, yes, naturally, she was so small and frail. She was only 5. And my cousin Anne would not stay without me. She was absolutely adamant she was not going to leave me. She was actually very frightened and very attached to me. And after a little while they relented, and they said they'll take us, and this was actually a home with all, a barrack with Dutch children, and they had an amazing story which I don't have time to tell you. Now, even there, I succumbed to typhus. I remember lying on my upper bunk by the window, and I must have come back into I can't think of the word, into consciousness. And I saw people running, and they were, I didn't know why they were running or where they were running. But all I could think of was how did they have the strength to run? Because typhus is such a debilitating condition that you just can't move a muscle. And that was the 15th of April 1945, when we were liberated by the British Army. And that is basically the end. I won't tell you about the rest, but only to say that the British soldiers were absolutely wonderful in the way they treated us, and suddenly we were people, and we counted, and they were so kind to us. And well, that was it. I just want to stress the kindness of the soldiers, and because you can be very proud of the British Army, British soldiers. And I'll stop here, and thank you very much for listening.
Adon